I'll start by welcoming everyone to Expert Talks Online. I'm Lisa Copeland. I'm part of the strategy group here in the US of A. This evening is the fourth session in our summer series where we'll be covering a diverse range of topics. And tonight we're exploring your digital transformation isn't digital or transformation will probably fail with our very own David Cox, a leader in the transformation at Equal Experts. After Dave's talk, we'll run, that's okay. After Dave's talk, we'll run a Q&A session as time permits. Now just a little bit about the meeting protocols. You can start adding your questions now using the Zoom Q&A function. We'll be answering the top voted questions, so do keep an eye on what questions are being added and vote for those you'd like to see covered. I will now hand it over to you, Dave. It's all yours.
Thanks very much. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. As you can see, hello. The agenda is quite simple. We've got a lot of ground to cover and it's hot, so we should get cracking. So I wanted to start with a story. So you're in Japan, and the new CEO of a bullet train company makes an interesting decision to increase the number of trains in operation at any one time and to improve the timeliness of those trains in service. He identifies that the amount of time the trains sit at the platform to be cleaned at the end of their journey can be reduced. As a train traveller himself, he's noticed that when the train rolls in and the platform is announced, the passengers congregate on the platform and wait for the train to be cleaned. The staff inside are dressed in uniforms which match the livery of the train, in this case, a kind of sky blue. That makes them difficult, if not impossible, for the waiting passengers to see against the seats. Now, if the train is particularly messy, it takes upwards of 20 minutes to clean the train and allow the passengers on board. So the passengers stand there, impatient to start their journey. And the CEO's bet was a simple one, but it wasn't obvious. He changed the uniforms to make the staff stand out more to a kind of bright or hot pink, so that the passengers could easily see them working from one end of the train to the other. And the staff became a sort of visual thermometer. So you know how long it's going to take before you're allowed onto the train because their progress was obvious. It was right there in front of you. And what's more, the cleaners are now thanked more often for their efforts, which in itself is motivating. And it gives their work meaning and value, which in turn improves their productivity. And the average time to clean a train drops from 20 to around 7 minutes. And the CEO's strategic goals of more trains in service, or more of those trains on time, is achieved. So changing the colour of the uniforms was a transformative idea. So I want to tidy some things up before we go too much further. In my opinion, digital transformation isn't a thing, and the goal of being more digital isn't worth pursuing. Now, at a push, you could say, typically, there are aspects of a thing that people commonly refer to as transformation that are enabled by digital, but I acknowledge that isn't very catchy. So in my experience, digital is a means, not an end. It's a tool that can be used for the right job at the right time and in the right way. Transformational change, as we heard about in the example of the bullet trains, doesn't necessarily need a single line of code. And we can go further. So as I was preparing for this talk, I realized I was becoming skeptical about the word transformation itself, at least in its traditional sense of a quick and complete remaking. That is, a man goes to bed and he wakes up a cockroach, or an articulated lorry turns into a heroic robot. So transformation, in the business sense at least, is not a discrete phenomenon with a beginning state and a radically different end state. It's instead about a commitment to continuous change. Now, the current archetypal digital transformation is to re-platform from a legacy monolith onto a new microservices architecture. And that's where the issue begins to reveal itself. Today's new is tomorrow's legacy, surely. And one day that shiny new microservices architecture will need to be replaced by something that in time will also need to be replaced, and so on and so forth. So my argument during this talk is that transformation is less about checking tasks off a to-do list and more about building a resilient and responsive culture. We'll have a look at some companies that have succeeded during the lockdown and some that haven't. But being successful is not about a quick or complete remaking, and nor is it about some fantastic digital idea. The common denominator amongst the successes is their ability to absorb shocks, to learn lessons, to perform experiments, and to respond proactively to change quicker and better than their rivals. So beyond the statements, not all transformations are digital and not all change is transformation, we might add transformation, meaning a quick and complete remaking, is not a thing. So what I'm saying here is there are no companies that have rapidly and fundamentally transformed and stayed successful. So when this idea first occurred to me, it felt quite radical. I hunted for examples that might prove me wrong. I eventually found a company that seemed to do just that, a company that had completely remade itself digitally, and that was Nintendo. So here's a brief summary of some of the relevant parts of their story. Nintendo were formed in 1889, and they started out selling handmade playing cards that were used for gambling. This is not something that Nintendo likes to talk about, but it's true. 70 years later, a big milestone in their history, Nintendo struck a licensing deal with Disney in the US to include some cartoon characters on their playing cards. This was a game changer, opening up lucrative new markets, and indeed, it meant that Nintendo could go public 3 years later. Ownership of the company over this time had passed down through various sons and cousins and nephews before ending up in the hands of a dissolute fellow. So with money burning a hole in his pocket after floating successfully on the stock exchange, he set out to transform Nintendo. Now, he invested in things which one presumes he was interested in, taxis, instant rice, vacuum cleaners, and even, dare I say it, love hotels. But the only thing that Nintendo tried during this period that was successful enough to stick was making toys. And after all that, it was Nintendo's hard-earned and long-established expertise in making card games that helped them diversify slowly and incrementally into an adjacent space. During the 60s and 70s, Nintendo tried many things, had many hits and misses. But one thing they did learn was that electronic toys had the highest margin. And in that category, the biggest hit of all was a light gun. So around this time, in 1972, the first ever video game console was released. It was called the Magnavox Odyssey. And Nintendo's light gun was chosen to be the accessory for a best-selling duck shooting game. Nintendo, at the same time, negotiated their way into becoming the exclusive supplier of that console in Japan, which allowed them to build up knowledge of that market at low risk through partnership. Now, between the mid-70s and early 80s, Nintendo used that knowledge of the video game console market and then their historical expertise in games and toys to start making video games themselves, culminating in the launch of Donkey Kong in 1981. All was going well until 1983, which saw the great video game crash when the US market shrank almost overnight by about 97%. Now, the story behind that is long and complicated, but in essence, to maximize short-term revenues, Atari dropped their standards and aimed for quantity over quality, allowing bad games onto their console. And this culminated in the notoriously botched E.T. movie tie-in game. The failure of that game caused a massive disruption, a terrible shock to the video game market. But Nintendo took time to reflect on the root causes so that they could avoid making the mistakes that Atari had made. And as a result, redefined their mission. They became about high quality and family fun, and all their games would now carry a seal of approval guaranteeing both. 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was released, only 2 years after the market in the US shrank by 97%. And it was a massive success, selling over 62 million consoles and hundreds of millions of games. Now, this is a journey of 131 years, but where exactly had Nintendo gone in all that time? The journey from card games to video games is hardly a radical remaking, and their success ultimately rests on staying true to their core mission, which reaches back at least to the 1950s, if not before. They're a family company. They make fun, child-friendly, high-quality gaming experiences. This has meant refusing to follow certain extremely lucrative trends in the market, such as You won't find Call of Duty on a Nintendo console, nor will you find a violent game like Grand Theft Auto. To have behaved otherwise would have undermined their position in the market. They stay true to themselves. And the story of Nintendo, for me, reinforced that being successful is about solving valuable problems in a way that differentiates you in the market. Abiding sources of competitive advantage are built around investing only in those things that differentiate you in the eyes of your customers. And that involves hard choices towards some things and away from others. So I wanted to kind of feel along this thread a little bit and talk about Greggs, very close to my heart. Greggs are worth over £1 billion. They have over 2,000 stores. Sales last year were up 19%. The share price was up by a similar amount. In 2020, they had plans to open up another 100 stores, focusing particularly on airports and train stations. Revenues of over £1 billion. The shares are up 20%. Greggs does not have an online store. Greggs has instead achieved success through product innovation, such as their game-changing vegan sausage roll, refurbished stores with free Wi-Fi, and other good ideas, such as in-store bouncers at night. And when considering the concept of home delivery, Greggs weighed up whether this was a problem they wanted to claim, and they ultimately decided, no, it's not. Instead, they partnered with aggregators in that space like Deliveroo or Uber Eats. And even then, minimized their exposure to risk by launching first only in one city over Newcastle. They tested the mechanics of it, and then they expanded into 2 cities, and then 4, and so on and so forth. And what's more, from the very beginning, Greggs introduced a £1.50 flat fee delivery charge, which is above the average in-store spend of £1.20, whilst most, if not all, of their rivals have never, and therefore cannot ever, charge a delivery fee. I think it's pretty clever stuff. But how clever does a high street brand without an online store look in the age of COVID? Well, as Greggs stores were completely shut for 3 months and only 800 of their 2,000 reopened in mid-June, following a trial in a small number of stores back in Newcastle again, they returned with a slimmed down menu, mercifully keeping that vegan sausage roll. And they announced they're still going to open 60 of those 100 stores they plan to open this year, and the share price rose by 5% on the news. In parallel, Greggs made a pretty smart move in that they started to shift their rental payments from quarterly to monthly, putting the squeeze on commercial landlords who find themselves in no fit position to negotiate. This all means that Greggs still expect to make a profit this year. So just think about that. They were shut down completely for 3 whole months. When they reopened, they only opened less than half capacity. They still don't have an online store, and they're planning on making a profit. Now, them not having an online store isn't about them not having an online store, but it's about a mindset. This is a company that has grown to be worth over £1 billion through product thinking. They experimented with how they could reopen using a small number of stores in a particular city. They tested their offering with customers and returned with a slimmed down menu of core items, simplifying their supply chain and optimizing margin. They renegotiated their rent. They built up a resilient and flexible capability, which helps position them advantageously in any market, however tough the conditions. That is transformation. Another high street brand who have zigged rather than zagged is Primark. They're worth about 850 million at the last count, and in 2019 opened the biggest clothing store in the world down in Birmingham. In fact, across their 400 stores, they have some 7.5 million square feet. Now, all around them, other high street brands are failing, even before COVID. Do you know what's interesting about Primark? Well, like Greggs, they don't have an online store either. You cannot buy Primark clothes online. So their success is about inverting conventional retailing wisdom. Instead of making you wade deep into the store to find what you want, and therefore theoretically increasing your chances of snagging your eye on something else you might want to buy, Primark put their newest, their best, and their most desirable stock near the doors. You can enter, get what you want, check out quickly and easily, and leave. In the meantime, the high street is flooded with shoppers carrying Primark branded bags, creating an army of free advertising whilst their rivals get passed by. But what about COVID? A clothing retailer with no online store surely would be destroyed by months of lockdown. Well, in March, Primark had to close down their entire network of 370 stores. They furloughed some 30,000 staff in the UK alone, which reduced their overheads by 50%. They still had to write off over £284 million worth of stock, in particular stuff they'd lined up in anticipation of the Japan Olympics and the Euro 2020 football tournament. At the same time, they made a strange move to increase their costs by renting 30% more warehouse space to store the £1.5 billion worth of stock, which was going to go unsold. This actually went up to 1.9 billion in May, just more than double the usual amount. Now, their bet was that much of the spring-summer collection could be held over till 2021. And in the meantime, the plan was to reopen and work through the non-seasonal basic clothing without any heavy discounting that was being applied by their rivals. Their bet was people still need socks and pants. Their stores reopened in England on the 15th of June. And whilst fewer customers were reported, especially in city centre stores due to lack of office workers and tourists, those that did shop in Primark had larger average basket sizes. Now, Primark's half-year figures came out recently with revenue down 75% over the period, a complete disaster. But they've opened 5 new stores since March, and they still plan to open 5 more. And when their CFO was asked about their online store, he said, "We have no immediate plans." And when the British Chancellor offered companies a job retention bonus scheme, essentially £1,000 for every furloughed worker brought back to work, worth over 30 million to Primark, they refused. And they gathered great headlines and many admirers for it. And I quote, "If you don't need the money, why take it?" This was an incredible flex and a brilliant public relations move. And they too, like Greggs, expect to turn a profit in 2020. And for my money, they're another brilliant example of a resilient and responsive culture and mindset that's helped shape a great response to an unprecedented crisis. But what about someone who's zagged with everyone else, like John Lewis? Being a department store in the UK is a terrible place to find yourself at the moment. And many of John Lewis's rivals in the UK, like House of Fraser or Beals or Debenhams, have all gone into administration this year, causing thousands of job losses. And even before the lockdown, John Lewis was having to make the unprecedented announcement in their 156-year history that they were closing stores and jobs were being lost. But why? Well, retail analysts' best guess was that the huge investments John Lewis made in their online presence had hit the trading economics of their physical stores. So 2 data points to consider before the pandemic. Due to the contracts they'd signed, their fixed physical costs, such as rent, had increased by double digits over the previous 3 years. And the other data point to consider is that around 25% of their revenues were coming through their online stores. So in essence, John Lewis bet the farm on the 25% at the expense of the 75%. That hard choice comes at a cost. Typically now, their stores are scarcely populated with staff. The shop is confusingly laid out according to those old retail models inverted by stores like Primark, which force shoppers to browse. And often items are just out of stock and customers are urged to go online instead. And how have John Lewis fared during and since the lockdown? Well, they've got a great online store and a relatively strong track record in that space. Surely they're in a good position to weather this storm. Well, actually, they're looking down the barrel of a 35% sales decline, and that's with an 84% increase in online revenue during the second quarter of this year. However, in both online and physical channels, the average basket size has fallen dramatically, squeezing profits, which have fallen over 65%. And as the CEO memorably said, people are buying more Scrabble and fewer sofas. And last month, the group announced they were closing 14 stores, including a flagship store that only opened in 2015, meaning 1,300 job losses. They're also reducing their marketing spend by 100 million, and their shares remain 10% down on where they were pre-lockdown. So at the peak of lockdown, online revenues at John Lewis went from 25% to as high as 50%. But the question remains, as stores reopen and this falls back, where does this leave John Lewis? Do they have the required mindset and culture to change for the better? What if they zigged towards their core majority market and invested in their physical stores? To boost the number of shoppers and the average size of the basket, would you buy a sofa without ever seeing it in person or without ever sitting on it? And at this point, people might say, well, we live in a digital age, and to invest in physical stores at a time when digital revenues are through the roof across the board would be foolishness. I mean, maybe. No one knows the future or the outcomes in another universe in which John Lewis made their online investments proportional to their online sales and instead spent all that money on store refurbishments, experiments with different in-store layouts, product diversification, etc., etc. My point is that strategy and transformation is not about being able to accurately guess the future. That's impossible unless you're a time traveler, in which case you should be down the bookies, not listening to this talk. All other things being equal, successful strategies rely on being more resilient and responsive to change than others. Before we move on, I wanted to quickly share something interesting with you. I recently worked with a client in the QSR space, QSR being quick service restaurants or fast food as it was known. And they'd embarked on an ambitious transformation journey. They wanted a new app, new back-end platform, new website, new microservices architecture. They wanted to go to the cloud for the first time. You name it, they wanted it. And they'd raised millions and worked hard for 2 years and released nothing. In the meantime, disruptors like the aforementioned Deliveroo and Uber Eats had entered the market, and restaurant chains such as, I don't know, Nando's or Wagamama, to name but two, had vastly improved their collection experience. 2 years of delivering nothing during a time of unprecedented disruption. And what do you think happened to their business? Their revenues went up. The urgent language of impending doom used in the initial business case to fund the transformation had been proved completely wrong. It was a head scratcher. Now, interestingly, the answer might well be a rising tide lifts all boats. So for a QSR company with 90% of their business online, apps like Uber Eats normalized the ordering of takeaway food online or on an app, dragging less innovative incumbents along with them. So returning to John Lewis, what if their success in the online channel is a symptom of a similarly lifted boat? During lockdown, Amazon revenues went up 40%. Their annual revenues are now £1.1 trillion. This isn't some overinflated Tesla-type market valuation. This is sums received within 1 single year. Now, it took Amazon 20 years to reach revenues of 100 billion in 2015. They're now making 10 times that amount than they were 5 years ago, and it was hardly a small base then. You cannot be that big and grow that much in such a short period of time and not cause a considerable ripple to the underlying mechanics of the online shopping market. And this is crucial to bear in mind when making significant strategic decisions. But the sensible advice is to extrapolate from the evidence in front of you. Your sales are up in the online channel, and in general, during and after lockdown, the mega trend in retailing is towards online and away from physical stores. Companies like John Lewis might decide quite rationally to invest further in online because that's where the money is at the expense of their physical stores. But what if this situation is unique to these strange times and temporary? What if during this period, Amazon has normalized online shopping for vast new segments of the market, lifting all the other boats? What if customers who used to buy at John Lewis in person went online when the stores shut down out of brand loyalty, with many of them buying online for the very first time? Now that the stores have reopened, some will simply return to buying in person, reducing their online sales. Others will recognize the convenience of shopping online and stick with John Lewis online, but with smaller baskets. And some will start to look around for deals on the web. You can, after all, buy Scrabble anywhere. So as discussed, to be successful, you have to differentiate yourself by offering something different and valuable. Ultimately, John Lewis can't really hope to win online against Amazon, and that's even with a good or great online store. My guess is that they can achieve success easier and more effectively by returning, like Nintendo, to their traditional strengths, that is, their physical stores. But who knows? I certainly don't, but only time will tell. Right, I want to regroup before we finish up by talking about why transformations fail. We've covered a fair bit of ground already. I'll just run through some of the key points. Rapid and radical transformations rarely, if ever, result in success. Transformation typically means change and is both a mindset and a commitment, not a to-do list of deliverables. Digital is a means, not an end. You create and you sustain competitive advantage by being different, and you should only invest in solving valuable problems. The way successful companies identify valuable difference is through measuring the impacts of experimental interventions on behavior, whilst ensuring that evidence is gathered and attributable to your actions. And in this unprecedented moment, being resilient and responsive to change is more important than having a nice online store. Moving on. According to McKinsey, around 70% of all transformations fail. And in my experience, that number sounds low. McKinsey report the main reasons for transformations failing as follows. The CEO isn't being ambitious enough. There's too big a skills gap amongst the staff. There's a lack of robust change management infrastructure, and the process itself needs more governance. Well, just between us, I'll let you in on a secret. Not a single one of those ideas is right. In my experience, transformations fail because people do not feel that they have the capacity to engage with the change, which is scary because it's full of unknowns. And on the left-hand side of the slide is an owl called Plop. And he was afraid of the dark, which is a big problem for an owl. But people during times of change experience a similar fear. Darkness is scary because we don't know what's in it. So unpicking the real reasons why transformations fail requires us to consider three things. So taking these in order. There's a saying attributed to Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That is, if the cultural antibodies of an organization reject the strategic change, you're cooked. In transplant immunology, successful transplant rely on as close, including things like blood group and tissue typing. The best way to succeed is to fool the body into thinking the new thing isn't new at all. It's a good metaphor, but it's physical, it's not social or cultural. So I got to thinking, is there an example of how a different idea was made to look like the same idea, and in doing so, successfully change people's minds, their feelings, and their beliefs? Well, consider the image on the right-hand side of this slide. It's the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is the most visited Catholic pilgrimage site in the world, and the world's third most visited religious site, full stop, behind Mecca and Jerusalem. Picture a December morning in 1531, soon after the arrival of the conquistadors. There's a Mexican peasant called Juan Diego. He sees a woman who identifies herself to him as the Virgin Mary. So she's speaking in the language of the Aztec Empire. She tells him to go and gather Castilian or Spanish roses from the top of a nearby hill with his cloak. When he shook the roses out of his cloak, they left behind this exact image imprinted in the cloth. Some other facts. Guadalupe resembles the Aztec word for she who banishes those who devoured us. She's a mestiza with the skin tone and hairstyle of a local girl. That's not a crescent moon that she's standing on, but a cactus from which the sacred Aztec beverage pulque is derived. And an Aztec goddess was worshipped on the exact same hill as the roses. But this one image was instrumental in converting an entire culture to Catholicism, persuading the Mexicans to abandon their old beliefs in favor of those of their brutal oppressors. This was achieved in part by making the end state resemble the current state as much as possible. Before this, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white-skinned Jesus figure of traditional Spanish Catholicism had proved very resistible to the matriarchal Aztecs. They wanted and needed a goddess who looked and spoke like them and who was surrounded by familiar symbology. So when it comes to traditional approaches to transformation, the received wisdom is that the bigger the change, the bigger the communication required. You might remember that the first reason McKinsey listed for why transformation failed was the CEO wasn't ambitious enough. To create momentum, you need to rally the troops by creating an atmosphere of crisis. We urgently need to change, because if we don't and others do, we will be destroyed. This is the grand anti-pattern of communication during times of transformation, and nothing is more harmful to your chances of success. No matter what change you're trying to achieve, you have to avoid provoking a great flood of cultural antibodies by selling the unfamiliar through amplifying its similarity to the current state. And you reinforce the benefits of the change, not the peril, because fear eventually is a bad motivator. When running strategy sessions with clients, typically, we never have a problem getting senior leaders to think big. When you ask them to talk about the goals of their organization, it's pretty easy. They want to grow revenue, grow margin, be a great place to work, be data-driven, etc., etc. This is what people think of when you say the word strategy. But when it comes to exactly how you're going to make your strategic priorities happen, things become trickier. This is largely down to the unfortunate polarization of the terms strategy and tactics, in which one is good. Strategy is about blue sky thinking, moving fast and breaking things, transformation. And tactics, on the other hand, is bad. It's short-termism, incrementalism, detail. And this line of thinking is absurd and needs to be undone. The best way to make a transformational change is to match strategic direction with tactical action. Let me give you an example. I recently sat down and watched a documentary about how, during the 1980s, the FBI brought down the 5 families of the New York Mafia. Up until then, the feds admitted to having a very disorganized approach to organized crime. You pick up a street-level soldier, you throw them in jail, or at a push, you flip them into an informant. The captains, the underbosses, and the bosses pulling the strings never went anywhere near the crimes themselves and therefore remained untouchable. The strategy, as set down by lawyers like Rudolph Giuliani and others, was we need to bring down the whole structure across all 5 families. It was a very ambitious idea, but where do you start? Well, you start by thinking small. So through surveillance, you notice that one of the bosses has a chauffeur. In that car, you have reasonable cause to suspect crimes are being discussed. You go to a court and get them to agree to a wire. And in the meantime, you have to figure out how to get inside that car and where to place the wire so you can best record your evidence. Now, the FBI went to the trouble of buying the exact same make and model of that car the chauffeur drove, even down to it being the same color. Then they got a key from the manufacturer to unlock the door so they wouldn't have to force it. Then their technicians experimented with different locations for the bug, and they drove around and they talked and they recorded those conversations and they measured which locations were better than others. And once they had the optimal location, they then timed themselves opening the car door, placing the bug behind the heater in the dashboard, replacing everything and relocking the door. And they practiced this again and again and again and again until it was quick and automatic. This attention to detail was instrumental in achieving the overall strategic aim, because based on such evidence, the 5 families were successfully dismantled through the courts. Now, breaking problems down into their smallest meaningful components and experimenting to gather evidence that guides you towards the best outcome is at the heart of every successful transformation. The third and last reason why transformations fail is because, put simply, people are too busy. When embarking on a huge change program, senior leaders are often to be found trying to think their way around the fact there's a fundamental and insurmountable lack of capacity in the system. The gravitational pull of run tends to squash flat the spirit of change. They get excited about new organizational structures designed to unlock huge amounts of extra capacity, but these massive reorganizations rarely, if ever, work people don't have or can't find the time to engage with change at work. But why is this? Bullshit Jobs is a book written by David Graeber. He's a professor of anthropology at London School of Economics. He traces the roots of this phenomenon to the technological unemployment predicted by classical economist J.M. Keynes in the 1930s. In essence, it runs thus. Due to the rise of automation, we humans should all be working a maximum of a 15-hour week by now. And yet we are more and more busy. So what's going on? Well, Graeber's observation and argument is that the time saved by technological advancements, such as automation, have been counterbalanced by the persistent and massive rise of pointless tasks in people's working lives. According to Graeber's research, some 40% of people think their job is entirely bullshit, which is terrifying. But what I want to talk about is the bullshitization of day-to-day work. So consider a team of developers who are being blamed for a lack of progress after management realized they were 2 years into a digital transformation, have nothing to show for it. Some numbers. The team is made up of 25 people. Assuming a 9 to 5 working pattern with an hour off a day for lunch, that's 175 working hours a day. Get 5 weeks of paid holidays and 8 bank holidays in England. That reduces the 261 working days a year to 228. Now you multiply that by the working hours in a day across the team, and that gives you 40,000 working hours a year, give or take. And according to management, the team hasn't achieved anything for 2 years. So let's call it 80,000 hours in total. And it's important at this point to mention that none of this team are incompetent or lazy. Indeed, they're a bright and hardworking bunch. So how is this even possible? Well, consider this: the interminable stand-ups across multiple locations that routinely overrun, the long, unproductive meetings, the pointless admin, like filling in time cards so finance can track who's working on what when, the update meetings with disinterested colleagues, the regular catch-ups, the weekly half-day governance meetings, the labyrinthine performance management processes, the time wasted each day trying to book a room, the pre-meetings, the post-meeting catch-ups. I could go on. The team were up to their nostrils and had at most about 45 minutes a day to actually do the day job. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Now, recently, some models that challenge traditional ways of working have acknowledged this malaise tacitly, if not explicitly. Consider, for example, the Spotify model of multifunctional co-located teams who take ownership and responsibility for the realization of an idea from end to end. Its power to unlock blissful productivity is in cutting out many of the empty ceremonies I just listed out. And as such, Graeber's book has led me to draw up a list of suggestions in an attempt to free up more time to think and interact meaningfully with one another whilst experiencing work in a more enjoyable and rewarding way, in no particular order. Teams work together closely on one priority at a time, so everyone's always up to speed, the number of distractions is minimized, prioritization is easy, and the members of the team help each other out when problems need to be considered from more than one angle. Members of the team communicate all the time with one another, so you don't need many meetings, and those you keep, you make sure they're short. One genuinely priceless piece of advice I give to clients, and I now give to you, is cut all your meetings in half and see what happens. There are no handovers, there are no handoffs, there are no dependencies, there are no blockers. All you need is already with you in the team. Kill all busy work and align yourself ruthlessly to the quality of outcomes, not the number of outputs. The work itself is given meaning by being transparently aligned to the strategic priorities of the organization. You're contributing to something important. The team employs an open and experimental mindset, and the path to value is defined by giving appropriate weight to each new piece of information you learn, integrating that with what you already know, and drawing a conclusion that incorporates both. Everyone talks honestly, openly, and constructively with one another so that ideas flow easily. And in this way, the way forward is co-created, so nothing feels new or different. Ideas are already familiar by the time you start working on them. Progress is easy and quick to measure, explain, and share with others, and successes are celebrated together. Now, hopefully, you're already doing some of these things. Maybe you're doing most of them. I share this list because I've seen these things work, and it's marvelous to see the amazing outcomes that happen as a result of happy people enjoying their work. And I'd like to see it happen way more often. We're going to end where we began. Change isn't necessarily transformation. Digital transformations are not a thing. And starting out on a program of change, senior leaders make the mistake of emphasizing the size of the challenge, the extent of the difference, the absolute brain-swoggling nature of the peril you face to bounce their colleagues out of a rut. This almost always guarantees failure through resistance. Instead, try and be creative about how to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be by using the familiar. Connecting strategic vision to tactical action is the key to successful change. The bullshitization of work is real and it matters. The psychological harm of doing work you know is pointless or useless is huge and proven. Being blissfully productive is the floor, not the ceiling. And every single one of us deserves to be happy, solving problems in a way that adds real value whilst working with people that you like and trust. That is, to a larger or lesser extent, the secret to a happy life. The billions are spent every year by companies trying to unlock productivity. But remember the cleaners on the bullet train. Their outcomes were massively improved through the simplest and cheapest thing imaginable, people saying thank you. So if you take nothing else away with you from this talk, remember to be kind to yourself and each other. And that's the end of that.
Thank you, Dave. That was awesome. I feel like I went through a learning and a little perspective changing. Really, really great. Got me thinking. We do have a couple of questions. Are you ready for a few?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we have one coming in from Charles, who is really interested in DigiHealth, the role of digital biomakers, wearable and sensors at medical tech, and the role of digital transformation in precision personalized health, a nascent sector in big pharma and patient care.
Mm-hmm.
Some thoughts on digital transformation, a lot of your 1, 2, 3. Is it different for the DigiHealth space?
It's a good question. I mean, I've worked with a number of clients in this space who are trying to figure this out. For example, a company who are looking here in the UK at waiting lists because due to COVID-19, a lot of demand has been deferred or diverted from the NHS as people try and help out the NHS by staying away. But it stores up millions of people on waiting lists for urgent or acute care, such as oncology, let alone things like replacements of hips, etc. And they were looking to use data pipelines and stuff to be able to reliably order the waiting lists so you saw the right people at the right time. Now, look, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Digital is still a very powerful tool, but as I said at the beginning, it has to be used in the right way at the right time by the right people to solve the right problems. Now, another one of my definitions is that you can only solve problems, or should only solve problems, that are valuable and are different and are valuable to the customers you're solving them for. And the things you just described tick all those boxes. And so I wish that sector all the very best.
Great. We have a question from Mark. Due to COVID, many companies need to change, and a lot. Sorry, my screen just moved. You use the example of Greggs and Primark as a high street brands without online stores. If Greggs and Primark decided tomorrow to launch an online store, what would be your advice to start?
Yeah, Mark, it's a good question. Well, I would rely on those two brands to approach it in the right way, which is experimentally. So they might open up a very low fidelity front door, their online store, where only certain people saw it. And then they would run an online store according to a very limited number of lines. And they would definitely not claim some of the commodity problems within an online store, such as a shopping basket or some aspects of security or access management. And neither would they claim the problem of delivery. They would make it someone else's problem, so they could stay true to their core capabilities as bakeries and clothing retailers respectively. So I'd expect them to take that approach.
Interesting. And I had a question, since we have a lot of time, and then we'll go back to Mark's question. From the Primark example specifically, prior to COVID, with the next generation of shoppers, right, who are really digitally native and looking for an in-store experience that could be a little bit different, a little bit look and feel. In your assessment, is Primark on the mark of really understanding that next gen shopper, or is there still some work that needs to be done?
It's a good question. I don't know, Lisa, sadly, if you're familiar with Primark. But one thing they did exactly to that market, which was a brilliant move, is that they did something very similar to Nintendo. They partnered with Disney. And so the only Disney cafes in the world that aren't on Disney-owned land are in Primark stores. So you can go in as a kid and you can you sit in Central Perk or a Disney cafe and get treated to a caramel latte, as well as go shopping for your latest top or pair of sweatpants. And it was a brilliant idea. They did bring that shopping experience through, particularly for that segment, who really wanted to look and feel and touch the things they were going to buy.
Cool, excellent. Let's see, another one in from Mark. This one is Sandeep. He's a contractor, data engineer, and often has worked at companies going through digital transformation. As an individual, how can I best approach the typical flaws with digital transformation?
Really good point. Well, as an individual, it's very difficult to make humongous impacts, but it is to make sure that you push to belong to a multifunctional team who are claiming and solving interesting problems in an interesting way, and you're being left alone in the pursuit of that you are autonomous. And you should expect those things, Sandeep, and you should demand them.
Are there ways, just to follow up, are there ways how you can benchmark autonomy, like for things that are new to an organization who have kind of, maybe they've just inherited more of a control, surveillance type of way of managing people? Are there benchmarks that can show, like that can indicate you're on your road to autonomy, decision-making work, etc.?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing you can do to demonstrate autonomy, or at least test the environment you're in, is to say no to things constructively, but openly, such as, I am not going to attend that 3-hour meeting unless there is an agenda and unless we really do need those 3 hours. And that immediate and direct action will hopefully prompt a set of questions about what is needed in order to make sure that I can do the job and the people around me can do their jobs to the best of their ability. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any command and control. That's the way to unlock productivity, because it's not true. But neither should we apply overly rigorous and traditional measures of command and control, because it does squash things flat typically.
Yeah. It's always finding that balance, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Mark has question number 2. You say the best way to make decisions is to be guided by the evidence. But what if the evidence available isn't enough to choose between 2 options with full confidence? What do you do then to avoid analysis paralysis?
Mark, that's another excellent question. Well, my inclination is towards this thing called Bayesian analysis. It's something that I touched on in the presentation, but only briefly. Bayesian analysis, by the way, is sitting behind many of the models trying to figure out this COVID-19 outbreak. And it is basically update your priors. So each one of us carries around a prior set of beliefs and uncertainties. And then each time we're given a new piece of evidence or information, we need to weigh that up against what we already know and then be prepared to change our minds according to how much weight we give that new piece of evidence. So at one extreme, there are people who will never change their mind. And then there's the other extreme, which is people always changing their mind according to the last thing they heard. Well, the best path to negotiate through those 2 points is to weigh up each piece of new evidence on its own merits, give it an appropriate weight, integrate it with your current thinking, and move forward from there.
Excellent. Enid, what's your #1 tip motivating an inspiring team at a business which is at the cusp of transformation, but who have been burnt by the slow and inefficient changes of the past?
Oh boy, Enid, good question. I mean, at the other end of the scale, I mentioned at the very end that successes should be celebrated often. And so wherever you make a success, however small, celebrate it. Get cakes in, candles, appreciate one another. Appreciate however small a change that's delivered and works, how important that is. Don't think that you can celebrate too often because you can't. And so, yeah, be kind to one another, celebrate your successes often, and as people, then model those behaviors that you want to see or be the change in the world. So other people will see you celebrating and will want to share in that success. It's a great way of selling change as well around an organization. So that would be, I like cake anyway, but like, yeah, cake and candles, that's my recommendation.
Okay, we have time for a few more. Let's see, we have Hannah. Digital transformation, like business agility, seems to suffer from being owned by IT. How can we demonstrate change?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Good one.
I mean, ultimately, change shouldn't be owned by any one single department, and that's why the Spotify model works in many ways, because it means that everyone you need is in the boat with you, and that means product owners, BAs, business subject matter experts. Maybe you need a developer, maybe you need an engineer, but you need all the people who are going to be affected by that change and who can affect that change in the boat with you. So no, not any, whether it's IT owns it, finance owns it, sales owns it, none of that works. That's a grand Andy pattern. You need to make sure it's a multifunctional, cross-functional change to which all people belong and are therefore invested in.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if like ownership comes from sponsorship of the dollars and cents that we need to like work with the organization to break down that kind of investment, right? Because what's good for the business is good for the business and makes for happy customers too.
Right.
Let's see, one last question from Katie. In my experience, many change initiatives fail as soon as individuals feel threatened, and perhaps with good reason. They may like the fact that they have less, what they feel like they may have less control, power, and status. What approaches have you used to help navigate through this type of obstacle?
Yeah, it's a good question. In another one of my expert talks, I talked about the frozen middle. So they are the bedrock of your organization. Typically middle managers, they are the most resistant to change because of that fear of loss of status and otherwise. But those people are also crucially important because without them, they will stop. Nothing is more effective in stopping organizational change than that cohort right there for those reasons. And the best way to do it, and it's a good piece of advice that I received not that long ago, is that you build a coalition of the willing. And so you try and convince the most convinced person and you work with them, and then they will convince the next most convinced person as a peer-to-peer thing. And you go from there. So in the past, when I first led a transformation, I made the huge mistake of trying to identify and then win over the most resistant person first. I thought that was the best way to establish a beachhead from which to then launch the rest of the transformation. But it broke my heart. It didn't work. It won't work. You work with those people who are more likely or indicated they already are somewhat convinced, and you build out from there.
Excellent. That's excellent advice. And thank you, David. I think our time is up. Many thanks to everyone for your questions and everyone else who's out there listening. I hope you all found it really useful session. Learning about digital transformation, not. Special thanks to you, David Cox. Next week, our summer series will move on to software development practices and infrastructure as a code. How well do they work together? We'll be featuring John Barber, an engineer here at Equal Experts, and exploring such topics as infrastructure as code. They're rapidly becoming a key part of cloud native engineering, and the hard gain experiences from writing software can be applied to infrastructure, but fundamental differences mean some fundamental approaches need to be reconsidered. So you can sign up at our website, and we look forward to seeing you there. And everyone, that is a wrap. Have a great evening.